Well, let's talk a little bit about business ethics. The reason we are studying business ethics is because this is a course on business law and social responsibility. So this is the point in the semester when we really spend some time talking about the idea of ethics and social responsibility. And I think it's important to start by talking about what is the difference between law and ethics. So we really think of law as being the minimum level of acceptable behavior in a society, and we kind of talked about that a little bit back in the first chapter. That the law really says, okay, this is the minimum that we'll accept from people in our society, and if you fall below that level of accepted behavior, then there can be consequences for not meeting those minimum requirements. Ethics is really an idea that's higher than that. So it's the idea of applying right versus wrong principles of behavior, what's right versus what's wrong. And in business ethics, then, we apply that to a business context. Why is it important? We'll talk about really the historically, the kind of the shareholder view of social responsibility was that a business really should maximize profits for its shareholders. We've really seen a shift in the change of ideas in that regard, to where now we really think more that businesses should really optimize their profits, but do so in a way that's moral and that is ethical, still within kind of the bounds of still making a profit. So one of the things that we've seen, some of the changes, things like companies reporting about carbon footprint, reporting about their green initiatives, or something called being LEED certified, L-E-E-D certified types of businesses. Some are also now reporting on things like triple bottom line. So people, profit, planet. How much profit do we make? What kind of impact do we have on people? What is our impact on the planet? And that's become a fairly popular way of reporting, the idea of reporting according to a triple bottom line. It's important for companies to really think about business ethics and its decision making. And if you pay attention in the news, you know, we can talk about the Volkswagen emissions scandal, where Volkswagen made its cars so that they falsified the emissions into the air. It has looks like it will be the largest criminal and civil fine in the history of the United States for its violating the Clean Air Act. So there's definitely some legal implications from that. There's also a public relations impact that comes from that. So Volkswagen, for example, saw a huge dip in its stock. We can point to other instances as well. General Motors had the ignition switch scandal that really had a big impact on their bottom line, at least for a period of time. So there's a public relations impact where customers really can leave. You can also have safety risks for consumers and employees that can impact both your bottom line, and it can impact your customer loyalty, and that also has some very long-term financial implications. We talked about really already I mentioned the relationship between law and ethics. So compliance with the law is sometimes what we call the moral minimum, but it does not necessarily mean that that's what society expects a business to do, just comply with the moral minimum. We really think that we want businesses to do something a little bit more than just what they're required to do legally. Ethics then as really kind of what is expected and how that ends up looking. Obviously we usually think of 4 levels of social responsibility. The bottom one being we want companies to comply with the law. We want them to be economically viable. We want them to be financially successful. But we also think of them as having kind of some ethical requirements as well. So sometimes we see those in company codes of ethics that a company will create that will set out the guidelines. What are our values? What is our mission? Who do we want to serve in our company? And so those can really become very important principles. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about ethical philosophies, really, ethical principles and ethical philosophies. And boy, we're really scratching the surface here by talking about some of the major themes in ethical philosophical reasoning. So really kind of on two ends of the spectrum, we can sort of divide ethical philosophies into either kind of outcome-based theories or duty-based theories. So outcome-based theories really look at what is an ethical outcome, and then you look at what actions do you need to take to get to that outcome. Duty-based theories look at what should my actions be, and then hopefully that results in an ethical outcome. So let's talk first about duty-based ethics. Duty-based ethics are really based on the concept really that everyone has certain duties or certain obligations to other people, to the human race, to the planet, even in some circumstances. And these ideas about duty-based ethics usually come from religion, philosophical reasoning, some people say revealed truths, and some of the major theories within this, are religious ethical standards, something that we'll call Kantian ethics or deontology, and then a third one that's the principle of rights. So religious ethical standards would say that, you know, in order to consider whether or not an action is ethical, every religion would generally describe how we should treat other people. Almost every religion has some semblance, for example, of what we might call the golden rule, that you should treat other people the way that you should want to be treated or would want to be treated. So that's a very broad, general religious principle that you can find in all of the major religions. Another area that we would look at would be something like a principle of rights. And this comes really more out of the rights theory comes more from old philosophers. So we think of Aristotle and Plato, for example, that talked about kind of a principle of rights, kind of a theory. And this really says, in deciding whether or not something is ethical, you think about what the effect the actions would have on the fundamental rights of other people. So that could be in a company, it could be your owners, your employees, your customers, for example, suppliers. And rights theory then would say that you can disagree about maybe whose rights are more important or less important. So that's one way that there can be a conflict under rights theory. And whoever's right you might elevate as being the strongest then would really dictate what the proper, again, your duty and the proper action would be. A third type of duty-based ethics is based on this idea of, it's actually deontology or Kantian ethics. They're really the same thing. And there was a German philosopher by the name of Immanuel Kant who said that that we really should act in a way that we would want everyone else to act in the same or similar circumstance. It sounds kind of similar, I think, to the golden rule, but the rightness or the wrongness of an action, and in this thing he called the categorical imperative, says that we're going to judge an action by estimating the consequences that would result if everyone else acted in the same way. So again, very much a duty-based theory, very much looking at the rights of other people and looking at what that action should be, as opposed to really kind of the other end of the spectrum, which looks at outcomes. So outcome-based theories of ethics then focus on the consequences and look at whether or not the consequences, then if I have good consequences, then those consequences can actually justify my actions. We'll talk about utilitarianism in just a moment, but there's also another theory that we call egoism, and egoism is also an outcome-based theory where if I'm an egoist, then I'm concerned about the consequences for me, and an egoist would say that whatever produces the best consequences for me is going to be the right action. So again, a consequential-based theory, I'm not looking at the actions I'm taking, I'm looking at the consequences. I'm saying what does it take for me to get a good consequence? And then that must be the right thing. Whatever it takes to get there would be the right thing because I'm going to do whatever it takes to get that good consequence. So that's one example of an outcome-based theory. And the other one is utilitarianism. And utilitarianism actually comes from the work of two English philosophers who were given the task of trying to evaluate whether or not legislation was ethical. And so if you kind of think of it from that frame of reference, they were really looking at, from a very broad perspective, you know, and almost a national perspective, whether or not an action taken by the legislature would be ethical. So they came up with this idea of utilitarianism, which said that an action is ethical if it produces the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. The greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. So as long as the majority is benefited by the action, then it is still ethical if it harms a smaller number. Now that's very different from what we just talked about with really a duty-based theory, you know, where we said you should treat people the way you would want to be treated, or you should act in a way where you would want the consequences to be the same for everyone, or you should act under rights theory in a way that respects the rights of other people. So utilitarianism says essentially you can't do that, so you should just act in a way that benefits the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism does several things. First of all, it requires you to decide who's going to be affected. And in fact, just kind of as an antidote, and anecdotally, slavery was actually justified a long time ago under a utilitarian theory because the people who were arguing in favor of slavery considered slaves to be property. And in fact, they were considered property historically. And so therefore, they weren't considered to be people who would be affected by legislation. So when you think of the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, sometimes utilitarianism allows you to select and choose who's going to be affected. Another way that we use utilitarianism is we can do a cost-benefit analysis. So if you've ever, for example, taken, you have a decision that you need to make, and if you do something like this, you do like a pro-con list, and you say, I'm going to write all the pros on one side and all the cons on the other side, and then I'll decide according to which side is the longest. Then that's really kind of a utilitarian type of an analysis that you can do. So you're going to choose the outcome that produces the maximum amount of utility. Okay, that's the end of the philosophy lesson. Currently, kind of more currently, in talking about some ethical principles and philosophies, corporate social responsibility is a concept that really came about in the 1980s, which said essentially that corporations have a responsibility to be good citizens. So to actually not just make a dollar, make a profit for their owners, but also to be ethical, to impact society, to maximize good effects on the environment. It's not anything that's legal. It's just really something that society pays attention to on varying levels, right, as to whether or not and how much we actually expect businesses to be citizens or good citizens or socially responsible citizens. Another way that we can look at decision-making in ethics is by looking at ethics in terms of a stakeholder analysis. So there's something in ethics that we call stakeholder-oriented governance systems. And a stakeholder-oriented governance system says that corporations can't just look at the investors, because there are so many other stakeholders, in other words, groups of people who have a stake in the decision-making of the corporation, that we have to think about the impact on those stakeholders as well. And so stakeholders would be not just your investors, but it would be your customers and your employees and your suppliers, the government, your community in which you operate, so that when a corporation a company makes a decision and they look at it from a stakeholder analysis, they're not just looking at money for the investors, but they're looking at what's the impact on my employees, what's the impact on my customers, what's the impact on my suppliers, what's the impact on the community at large. And that having a much broader basis for decision making helps companies make better decisions. So that's the way that we look at stakeholders and stakeholder analysis. The importance of ethical leadership has also become much more important. In fact, we have actually an initiative from our new chancellor of the UT system on leadership, and part of that is on ethical leadership. So making sure that that leadership has a component of ethics to it as well. And we find that even in some of the large pieces of legislation that we touch on, kind of wrapping up the chapter. Sarbanes-Oxley, hopefully most of you have heard of Sarbanes-Oxley. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act was passed after the energy company Enron filed for bankruptcy amid, at that point in time, the most massive fraud allegations in U.S. history. And it was passed in 2002, so it's been around for a while. And it requires publicly traded companies to set up confidential systems for whistleblowing, for people to basically blow the whistle on their employer. It requires employees to report behavior. It requires executives to sign off on the financial statements, essentially guaranteeing that all of those statements are not fraudulent. So there's a greater potential for individual personal liability for executives who sign off on those financial records. It also kind of uncoupled the idea of auditing and consulting. So an accounting firm that gives consulting work to a company cannot also audit them. So it's a huge piece of legislation, really has lots of different facets to it, but that's one of them. Global business ethics is another kind of important area. And we've talked about kind of the jurisdictional differences that really translates with ethics as well. So different countries and regions and states have different ethical expectations and different priorities. And that takes us really to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the FCPA, which you'll see was passed back in 1977. And it specifically prohibits U.S. companies from engaging in bribery in foreign countries, even if it's something that's standard practice in another country. U.S. companies can't engage in bribery. They can't bribe a foreign official for any kind of an official act. It does not prohibit something that we call grease payments, either to minor officials or grease payments that would speed up processing of paperwork or things like that. But I'll tell you, it's very interesting that the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act prosecutions by the Department of Justice have increased. That number that I saw was about 300%. And so the Department of Justice has really kind of caught on that this is going on in a lot of foreign countries. And companies that violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act can be fined up to $2 million. And individuals can be fined and can also do prison time. So there is a lot of policing of foreign bribery that's going on in the United States. So we want companies to be ethical. And that's the end of ethics.